Let me throw a question at you that sounds simple, but it's going to mess with your head. If you stop a random person on the street and ask, who won World War II? You'll usually hear the same two answers, America and the Soviet Union. Sometimes Britain gets a quick mention like a helpful teammate who showed up for the group photo, and that's wild because Britain wasn't a late arrival. Britain was in this fight from the opening bell to the final whistle. The war in Europe starts in 1939. Britain declares war on Germany in September of that year. The United States doesn't enter until December 1941. The Soviet Union doesn't start fighting Germany until Germany invades in June 1941, after a long stretch where Berlin and Moscow had a non-aggression pact and trade flowing between them. So how did we end up with a popular story where Britain feels like a side character? That's what this video is about. Not Britain won the war alone. That's not true, and it's not the point. The point is that Britain's role, especially the early role, often gets shrunk down, skipped over, or blended into someone else's highlight reel. And once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. Before we dive in, quick favor, if you like WWII stories that cut through the myths and stick to what actually happened, hit subscribe. These topics only work if we keep the conversation honest. Now, here's the core problem. Most people learn World War II as a sequence of famous scenes. Pearl Harbor, Stalingrad, D-Day, Hitler in the bunker, victory. But what if I told you a massive chunk of the war, the part where Britain is holding the line while Europe collapses, gets treated like the intro instead of the main story? Because that's what happens a lot. The timeline jumps from France falling in 1940 straight to Pearl Harbor in late 1941. Like the middle didn't matter. It mattered. A lot. Let's put you in May and June of 1940. France collapses fast, about 6 weeks from the start of the German offensive in the West to the French government seeking an armistice. Countries like Belgium and the Netherlands are overwhelmed. Norway and Denmark are already down. Suddenly, the map looks like this. Germany dominates the continent, and Britain is staring across the channel at an enemy who expects them to fold. And, from a cold, logical point of view, you can see why Hitler thinks Britain will negotiate. Britain's army has just escaped from Dunkirk, an evacuation that saves hundreds of thousands of troops, yes, but leaves behind piles of heavy equipment. Tanks, guns, vehicles, much of it has to be abandoned. Britain's air force is facing a monster. Britain's cities are exposed. An invasion seems possible. A blockade seems deadly. This is the moment where a rational country makes a deal and lives to fight another day. Britain doesn't. Britain stays in. And for a stretch of time that too many people barely talk about, Britain is basically standing there alone. No big Western ally on the continent. No American army, no Soviet army fighting Germany. Just Britain and the fact that surrender would hand Europe to Nazi rule. That decision isn't just bravery, it's strategy. Because as long as Britain stays in the war, Germany cannot declare the whole thing finished in the West. As long as Britain stays in, there's a base for air power, naval power, intelligence, and eventually a return to the continent. But staying in comes with a price. You've heard the word Blitz. But let's make it real for a second. Britain's cities, especially London, are hit repeatedly by German bombing. Night after night, people sleep in shelters, subway stations, basements, anywhere that feels safer than the street. Homes burn, factories get hit, docks get wrecked. The pressure is constant, and the goal isn't just destruction, it's morale. Break the population and you break the government. That doesn't happen. Britain bends, but it doesn't snap. Now here's the uncomfortable part. In a lot of modern memory, Britain's alone time feels like a waiting room. Like the real action starts when America joins. But in that waiting room, some of the most important fights of the entire war are happening. The first one is in the sky. Because if Germany is going to invade Britain, it can't do it safely unless it controls the air. If German troops and ships cross the channel under British air attack, that invasion turns into a disaster. So Germany tries to crush the Royal Air Force. This is the Battle of Britain, and it isn't a movie moment. It's a grinding campaign. Raids, losses, repairs, pilots flying again with barely any rest, ground crews patching up aircraft as fast as human hands can move. The Luftwaffe had been rolling through Europe. Country after country watched their air defenses get swatted aside. Germany expects Britain to be next. Britain isn't next. Britain fights back, and not just survive, fights back. Britain denies Germany what it needs. Over time, Germany's plan to force Britain to the table or clear the path for invasion fails. By the fall of 1940, Germany's invasion plan is effectively off the table. Not because Hitler got bored, because the conditions weren't there. And that matters more than most people realize, because that's one of the first major strategic setbacks Germany experiences. It's proof that the Nazis can be stopped. It keeps Britain in the war. It keeps a front alive in the West, even if it's not a land front yet. If Britain loses that battle, everything after it becomes almost impossible. So here's a question. Why doesn't the Battle of Britain sit in the center of how Americans talk about the war? Part of the answer is simple. Americans naturally focus on America's story. That's normal. Every country does it. But there's a bigger force at work too. One that shapes what gets emphasized, what gets minimized, and what gets remembered. And it's not just historians deciding that. It's politics, culture, and the fact that after 1945, the world rearranges itself around two superpowers. But we're not there yet. Before we get to the who gets credit problem, you need to understand why Britain's early war isn't just emotionally impressive, it's structurally essential. Because while the RAF is fighting for the sky, another fight is happening that decides whether Britain can even keep breathing. The ocean. This is the Battle of the Atlantic, and if it sounds less exciting than tanks and explosions, that's exactly why so many people underestimate it. Here's the reality. Britain is an island. It needs imports, food, fuel, raw materials, weapons parts. If those ships don't arrive, Britain doesn't just struggle. Britain starts to starve. Its war industry slows. Its military weakens. And, sooner or later, staying in the war becomes physically impossible. Germany knows that. So Germany unleashes submarines, U-boats, to strangle the shipping lanes. Merchant ships get hunted. Convoys cross freezing water under constant threat. Sailors die in numbers that rarely show up in blockbuster movies. And this isn't only about Britain either. Think bigger. If the Atlantic becomes a German killing zone that the Allies can't control, the entire Allied war effort changes shape. America can't reliably send men and equipment to Europe. Supplies that keep Allies fighting become harder to move. The war becomes longer, uglier, and maybe unwinnable on the terms we recognize. So the fight at sea becomes a fight for the entire alliance's future, even before the alliance fully shows up. And who is carrying that burden early on? Britain's Navy and Merchant Marine are right in the middle of it. British planning, British escort work, British survival problem. Over time, the Allies improve convoy tactics, detection, anti-submarine warfare, and intelligence. The point here isn't that Britain did every single thing alone. The point is that Britain is fighting for its life in a way that makes everything else possible later. Now let's add one more layer that people love to misunderstand. American industry in World War II is legendary, and for good reason. The scale of U.S. production once America mobilizes is enormous and decisive. But here's the part that gets glossed over when the story is told, like, America showed up and instantly carried everybody. Before America even enters the war, Britain has already shifted into total war mode. That means factories running hard, workers on long shifts, air raids still happening, production still happening anyway. The country is under pressure and still building fighters, bombers, ships, radar equipment, all while preparing for the worst. It's not some cute pregame. It's the main event, because Britain has to keep building while also fighting, because losing the air war means invasion, and losing the sea war means starvation. That combination, fight and produce at the same time under threat, is one of the reasons Britain's early war is so significant. And when you put these pieces together, you start to see why the Britain as sidekick framing doesn't fit the actual timeline. From 1939 through 1941, Britain is not doing background tasks. Britain is holding open the possibility of victory. Britain is denying Germany full control in the West. Britain is absorbing blows that could have ended the war early in Germany's favor. So why does the popular story skip those years? Because what people remember isn't just what happened, it's what got repeated the loudest afterward. And that's where things get tricky, because once the war ends, the fight over memory begins. The Cold War shapes everything. Two powers come out on top, and both have reasons, different reasons, to center themselves as the main hero of the story. And if you're Britain, exhausted and broke after years of war, you're not exactly in a position to pick a loud public fight over who gets top billing. But that's still only half the story, because the deepest credit shift isn't just about battles and headlines. It's about the hidden war, the information war, the stuff that stayed secret for years, long enough for the public to lock in a version of events that felt clean and satisfying. And once a clean story becomes popular, it's really hard to swap it out for a complicated truth. So let me leave you on this. Imagine fighting a war where one of your biggest weapons can't be talked about. Not during the war, not right after, not even for decades. Imagine knowing something that could explain why convoys survive, why plans work, why certain operations succeed, and being forced to stay quiet while the world tells the story without you. That's where we're going next. Now let's talk about the kind of warfare that doesn't leave craters, because one of the biggest reasons Britain's contribution got blurred is simple. Some of Britain's most important wins were hidden for decades. Not secret for a year, secret for a generation. And when the public can't see something, the public fills in the blanks with whatever story gets told the loudest. Start with the name most people recognize, Enigma. Germany used Enigma machines to encrypt military messages, orders, convoy reports, unit movements, stuff that if you could read it would be like looking over the enemy's shoulder. Britain built a major code-breaking effort at Bletchley Park. Mathematicians, linguists, engineers, analysts, thousands of people over the course of the war, working to crack and then keep up with changing German settings and procedures. This wasn't some magic trick where one genius solves a puzzle and the war is over. It was constant pressure. Break in, exploit what you can, protect the secret, and do it again tomorrow. When it worked, it could help the Allies make smarter decisions, especially at sea, where knowing where U-boats were operating could mean the difference between a convoy arriving or a convoy vanishing into the Atlantic. Here's the key issue for our story. Britain couldn't talk about it afterward. A lot of the intelligence work stayed classified for years, much of it not widely discussed until the 1970s, when secrecy rules eased and historians could finally publish fuller accounts. So think about what that means. For decades, the public story of the war gets built without one of the most important pillars even being visible. And in that gap, other versions grow, movies get made, simplified heroes get chosen. National pride does what it always does, pulls the spotlight toward itself. By the time the fuller truth becomes public, the popular version of events is already baked in. And history, once it turns into a neat story, doesn't like being told it needs revisions. Now stack another hidden weapon on top of that. Deception. The most famous deception effort tied to D-Day is often discussed under the umbrella of Operation Bodyguard, with fortitude as a major component, an attempt to convince German leaders the main invasion would come somewhere other than Normandy, especially around the Pas-de-Calais area. This effort leaned on a mix of tools: controlled leaks, double agents, fake units, and signals traffic meant to look real. The goal wasn't to make Germany clueless. The goal was to make Germany confident in the wrong answer. And if Germany holds armored units back, waiting for an invasion that never comes, that can reduce the pressure on the actual landing area when the real invasion hits, that matters on a human level. It means fewer Allied troops facing fresh German reinforcements in the first critical days. It also matters strategically, because D-Day wasn't just storm the beach and it's done. The landing had to become a lodgment, and the lodgment had to become a breakout. Time was everything. Now, was deception a British-only operation? No. It was Allied. But British intelligence and British counterintelligence networks played a central role in how the deception system in Britain worked, because Britain had been building those capabilities from the early war years, while it was still fighting under direct threat. And again, deception is hard to show in a simple way. A tank battle is easy to film. A double agent being handled or a fake unit being sold to the enemy through controlled channels is harder to capture without turning it into fiction. so a lot of public memory defaults to the obvious stuff: who landed, who shot, who died. The unseen architecture that made those landings more survivable gets less attention, which brings us to the biggest example of all: Normandy. If you grew up on American pop culture, the mental picture of D-Day is basically one location: Omaha Beach. And to be clear, Omaha was horrific. American troops faced intense defenses and took heavy losses. There's no need to downplay that to make any other point, but D-Day was not one beach, and it was not one country. There were 5 landing beaches in the main amphibious assault. American forces landed at Omaha and Utah. British forces landed at Gold and Sword. Canadian forces landed at Juneau. Beyond that, airborne troops dropped inland to seize bridges, disrupt German movements, and protect the flanks of the landing zones. Naval forces protected the invasion routes and provided gunfire support. Air forces attacked key targets, flew cover, and kept German aircraft from turning the beaches into a slaughterhouse. And the command structure reflected a coalition. Dwight Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander. But major naval and ground commands included senior British leaders, and the planning staffs were mixed. This was a joint machine: British, American, Canadian, and others, built to do one of the hardest operations in military history. So why does the public story so often feel like America did D-Day and the rest were extras? Because the way most people learn history isn't by reading staff histories or operational reports. It's by absorbing the loudest version of the story: blockbuster films, best-selling books, and simplified textbook chapters. And after 1945, America had the world's biggest cultural megaphone. Hollywood could turn the war into a set of iconic scenes. Those scenes naturally centered American characters for an American audience. Over time, those scenes didn't just entertain, they became the default memory for millions of people. So the popular image of Normandy narrowed until it was basically one dramatic lane of the war, starring mostly Americans. Meanwhile, the British and Canadian roles often got treated like supporting material, mentioned but not felt. Now add one more ingredient: the post-war world needed a hero story. The United States came out of the war as a global superpower, economically strong, militarily dominant, culturally influential. The American century is starting. A superpower doesn't just project force, it projects narrative. And a clean narrative is tempting. America arrives, liberates Europe, saves democracy, defeats tyranny. That story contains real truth. America's role was enormous and absolutely crucial. But that story also gets cleaner if you minimize the uncomfortable part: that Britain had been fighting for years before America entered the war, and that Britain had already carried huge burdens in the air, at sea, and in intelligence. Now look at the other superpower on the map. The Soviet Union also had a hero story. In Soviet memory, World War II is primarily the Great Patriotic War, where the Red Army breaks the Nazi war machine through sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. And again, there's real truth there. The Eastern Front was brutal and decisive. The Soviet Union suffered staggering losses. Battles like Stalingrad and Kursk mattered massively. But Soviet messaging had a goal: center the USSR as the main victor and treat the Western Front as secondary. In that story, the Normandy landings become a late operation after the Red Army has already crushed Germany's strength. The air war over Britain fades. The early years, when Britain is fighting Germany while Stalin and Hitler still have a pact, are not highlighted. And there's a practical reason for that. If you draw too much attention to 1939 and 1941, you have to talk about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the early period of Soviet-German cooperation. You also have to talk about the fact that Britain is still fighting when others aren't. That's not a comfortable fit for a story where one side is the single heroic driver of victory. So you end up with two massive narratives, American and Soviet, both centering themselves. And in both, Britain is reduced, not erased completely, just squeezed smaller, pushed to the edge, treated as the helpful partner rather than the essential pillar. Now here's a detail that often gets missed, especially in the modern scoreboard version of history. Britain's war effort wasn't just Britain in the narrow modern sense. In 1939, the British Empire and Commonwealth represented a global structure. Forces from across that system fought under British strategic direction and alongside British units. Indian troops fought in multiple theaters. Canadian forces were deeply involved in the air and land war and later fought in Northwest Europe. Australians and New Zealanders fought in places like North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. South Africans and African units served in different campaigns. Their contributions were real, and those men deserve credit as Indians, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, because that's who they were. But here's the accounting effect that changes how people perceive Britain's scale. When people talk about the United States in World War II, they treat it as one integrated national war effort. When people talk about the Soviet Union in World War II, they typically treat it as one integrated war effort across its republics. But when people talk about Britain, modern storytelling often splits the empire and commonwealth into separate national buckets, then talks about Britain as if it only means the British Isles. That division makes Britain look smaller than the structure it actually led in 1939-1945. It's not that separating them is morally wrong. It's that the separation changes the mental picture. It turns a massive global war effort coordinated through Britain into a set of separate efforts that don't feel connected. The result is that Britain's strategic role can look lighter than it was, especially to audiences who don't live inside the details. Now bring this back to the main theme, credit. Britain's role gets reduced through a mix of things happening at once. First, the early years get skipped because they aren't America's war yet, and because the Cold War story prefers a two-giant framework. Second, intelligence and deception remain secret long enough for public memory to form without them. Third, modern storytelling breaks apart the empire-commonwealth structure, shrinking Britain's perceived scale. Fourth, pop culture, especially American pop culture, locks in a set of images that become more real to people than the broader operational truth. And once that machine starts running, it's hard to slow it down, because correcting it requires effort. It requires more complicated explanations. It requires admitting that victory was coalition warfare, messy, shared, dependent, and interconnected. That's not as satisfying as a clean hero story. So here's the question that should be bugging you right now. If Britain's role is this central, if it's present in the early survival years, the Atlantic lifeline, the intelligence war, the deception systems, and the structure of the Normandy operation, why didn't Britain fight harder after the war to protect its place in the story? Why allow the popular memory to drift? Why stay quiet when movies and textbooks flatten the picture? That's where the story gets almost painful, because the answer isn't just about history, it's about power after the war. Money, security, pride, survival. And once you see what Britain looked like in 1945, victorious but exhausted and broke, you start to understand why winning the war and winning the story are two different battles. And Britain didn't have the resources to win both. By 1945, Britain is on the winning side. But Britain is not winning in the way most people imagine. The country has been at war since 1939. Its cities have taken punishment. Its economy is strained. It has poured money, manpower, and industry into survival for years. And the bill is brutal. So when the war ends, Britain faces a choice that doesn't sound dramatic, but it shapes everything that comes after. Do you spend your energy fighting for recognition and narrative? Or do you spend your energy trying to secure your future in a world where the power balance has completely shifted? Britain chooses the future because here's what 1945 really looks like. The United States is rich, intact at home, and bursting with industrial power. The Soviet Union is enormous, armed, and sitting across Eastern Europe. Those are the two poles of the New World. Britain, meanwhile, is victorious but financially battered. It needs loans. It needs trade. It needs a stable international system. And very soon, it needs security against Soviet expansion. That makes America not just an ally, but the ally. So if you're Britain, do you pick a public fight with the country you now rely on for economic support and strategic partnership over historical credit? Or do you swallow your pride and keep the alliance tight? Britain swallows it. And this matters more than people realize, because who gets remembered often comes down to who keeps talking, who keeps publishing, who keeps filming, and who keeps broadcasting. America can do all of that at a global scale after 1945. Britain can't, not in the same way. And there's another factor that's real, even if it's uncomfortable to say out loud: cultural habits. American culture rewards big storytelling. You celebrate victories. You sell the message. You turn history into a clear narrative with heroes front and center. British culture, broadly speaking, tends to lean the opposite way. Understatement, restraint, discomfort with bragging. The whole keep calm mindset didn't come from nowhere. It reflects an attitude that showing off is tacky. So when the post-war narrative contest begins, America has the megaphone and the marketing instincts. The Soviet Union has state propaganda and total control over education across a huge bloc. Britain has modesty, exhaustion, and a real need to stay aligned with the United States. That is not a recipe for dominating global memory. Now let's layer in something that supercharges this effect: the Cold War itself. Once the Cold War begins, World War II stops being just a historical event. It becomes a political resource. Every side uses it to justify who they are in the present. For America, World War II becomes proof of moral leadership, liberator, defender of democracy, the country that stepped in and saved the day. For the Soviet Union, World War II becomes proof of sacrifice and legitimacy, the Red Army as the force that crushed Nazism and earned a right to shape Europe. Both stories have truth inside them. America's contribution was enormous and decisive, especially once the U.S. mobilized fully. The Soviet Union fought a horrifying, massive war in the East and suffered casualties on a scale that's hard to even process. But when those stories become political tools, they get sharpened into simpler shapes. And in those simplified shapes, Britain gets pushed into the margins. Because Britain is inconvenient. For the American story, Britain complicates the idea that America arrived and immediately became the main driver from the start. It forces the timeline to include the years before December 1941, when Britain is carrying the war alone in the West. For the Soviet story, Britain's early role highlights the awkward reality that from 1939 to mid-1941, the USSR wasn't fighting Germany, and that Soviet-German relations included formal agreements and significant trade. So across two opposing narratives, Britain gets the same treatment: reduced importance, reduced visibility, reduced emotional weight, and then pop culture locks it in. If you want a hard truth about how people know history, it's this: most people don't learn it from archives, they learn it from stories. Stories they hear in school, stories that show up in movies, stories that get repeated every time a new generation comes of age. And America's cultural output after 1945 is massive. It's everywhere. So World War II becomes a set of American-centered images for much of the world. American troops landing, American flags, American victories. Again, not fake, but partial. The same thing happens on the Soviet side with state-controlled memory. The Red Army, the Eastern battles, the March to Berlin. Again, not fake, but partial. And the combined effect is a global memory, where Britain's role is treated like background texture instead of a structural pillar. Now, why does any of this matter? Some people hear this conversation and think it's just about pride, like it's a contest over who gets the biggest trophy. But that's not the real cost. The real cost is what it does to how people understand war. Because if you absorb the simplified story, two giant powers crushed Germany through size and strength, you miss the lessons that actually make World War II valuable to study. You miss what Britain demonstrates in 1939-1941, that holding on when you're outmatched can change the whole strategic picture. Britain didn't beat Germany early because it had infinite resources. It survived by mobilizing hard, innovating quickly, and fighting with discipline under pressure. It held the air. It held the sea lanes long enough for the alliance to fully form. That matters because it shows how wars can turn on resilience, geography, and strategic endurance, not just raw numbers. You also miss the intelligence dimension, code breaking, analysis, signals, deception. These were force multipliers. They didn't replace tanks and troops, but they made tanks and troops more effective. They reduced uncertainty. They shaped decisions. They saved lives. When you reduce World War II to a strength contest between giants, you underplay the parts of war that are most relevant to modern conflict: information, logistics, coalition coordination, and technology. And then there's coalition warfare. The Allied victory is not a solo performance. It's a joint machine built from countries that didn't always agree, didn't always move at the same speed, and didn't always share priorities, but had to operate together anyway. Britain's early survival keeps the West in the fight. The Soviet Union's Eastern War bleeds the German army on a massive scale. America's industrial and military mobilization brings overwhelming material power. Commonwealth forces expand the manpower and reach of the Allied effort. All of it interlocks. If you erase one pillar, you teach people the wrong lesson, that alliances are optional and that one hero nation can do it all. That's not what happened. Now, there's another human cost here too, because when we flatten Britain's role, we flatten the memory of real people. Civilians living under bombardment, sailors crossing the Atlantic under constant threat, pilots flying again and again until they're running on fumes, workers building planes and ships while air raids disrupt everything. And beyond Britain itself, millions of people across the Empire and Commonwealth who fought in multiple theaters: North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, the Mediterranean, and in the war against Japan, not as props, as real soldiers in real campaigns. They're not footnotes. They're part of the core story. So what do we do with that? Can the narrative be fixed? Honestly, not easily, because memory follows power. The United States still dominates global media. Russia's official memory culture still leans heavily toward the USSR won the war framework. Britain, for its part, has never been as aggressive about exporting a hero narrative, and after the war, it had practical reasons not to rock the boat. So the incentives to rewrite the popular story just aren't strong. But that doesn't mean the truth is unreachable. It means you have to choose to see the full timeline. You have to keep the early years in the story. You have to remember that Britain is fighting from 1939 onward, that it endures the Blitz, wins the Battle of Britain, fights for the Atlantic Lifeline, contributes centrally to intelligence and deception, and then helps build the coalition operations that return to Europe. And you have to hold two ideas at the same time, because both are true. America's contribution was massive and indispensable. The Soviet Union's sacrifice and victories were massive and indispensable, and Britain's role, especially in the years before America enters, was also indispensable. That's the hidden truth behind the argument over credit. Not that Britain did everything, but that the war cannot be honestly understood without Britain in the center of the picture, not pushed off to the side. So the next time someone tells you World War II was won by America and Russia, you'll know exactly what's missing. The country that stayed in the war from the start. The island that refused to negotiate when it looked hopeless. The air battle that stopped invasion plans. The naval struggle that kept the alliance supplied. The intelligence work that reshaped decisions and saved lives. The planning and coalition machinery that helped make Normandy possible. Britain didn't win the war alone. Nobody did. But Britain was a required ingredient in Allied victory. And the fact that this even needs to be explained tells you something bigger than WWII. It tells you how history gets remembered, not just by what happened, but by who had the power to tell the story afterward. And Britain, after paying the price to win the war, didn't have the power or the appetite to win the story. That's the real tragedy. Not that Britain fell, that Britain stood, and the world slowly forgot.